Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on mastering patient cost estimates, your guide to maximizing revenue. My name is James Muir. I'm going to be your host for this session. We're absolutely thrilled to have you with us, and we're really looking forward to an engaging and informative session. Just before we get started, let me go over kind of the housekeeping items, just so we have a smooth experience for everybody. But everybody, all the participants will be muted during the presentation to help minimize the background noise. And we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. But you can submit your question at any time using the Q&A feature. So just go there, put your question in there. It's a hot topic, so we're going to do our absolute best to address as many of the questions as we get as possible. If it turns out we're not able to get to your question because there's so many, we promise to email you afterwards. This webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to all the registered participants after the session. So you will receive an email with a link to this recording and some special additional resources that we'll mention during the presentation. And so now, without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. And it is a very hot topic. And so I thought to myself as we planned this, who could we have come and educate us on this topic that is the absolute best, that can educate us the best? And that person is Andrew Harding, who is the co-founder of Rivet. So please join me in welcoming Andrew, who is an expert in patient estimation, among many other things. And so for those that don't know him like I do, Andrew Harding, he's the co-founder and vice president of customer success at Rivet. He is an experienced healthcare consultant who specializes in operations management and process improvement, focused on the provider side of the healthcare revenue cycle. He's got a litany of degrees and certifications, which I'm going to spare you from, because you're going to see right from the get-go that Andrew is a wealth of knowledge, and we're really excited to have him with us today. So, Andrew, thank you so much for being with us. All right. Well, this is a very hot topic, and you may have more updated information. But Andrew, the last time I
Yeah.
checked, because of high deductible health plans, somewhere between 30 to 35% of all practices, overall revenue is now coming from patients. So everybody is interested in learning how we can do
Yeah.
better and more proactively collect that money from patients, because it seems like it's mission critical. So
Yeah. I think the kind of funny thing, and I was talking to a practice admin the other day, and they said for the first time, and they've been in the industry for 25 plus years. They said for the first time ever, their patient AR was higher than their payer AR. And I was like, that kind of took me back. I'm like, yeah, it really kind of matters who your ultimate payer is in these sense. So
it's
yeah,
a
kind of,
surprise to some folks to realize that for many practices that the patient is actually their biggest payer. Right. So that's but so tell us, historically, it's been pretty tricky to produce patient estimates and do it kind of in an efficient way. So maybe give us an idea of so what are the elements that are needed to pull this off, and why has it been so hard in times past?
yeah. And yeah, I think it'd actually be helpful. Can you see what I was thinking about this image a little while ago. Are you able to see this kind of fleur-de-lis looking
Yep,
the
I'm
ingredients
seeing
to
it.
achieve a
It,
perfect estimate?
it looks
Uh,
like a Venn diagram on steroids.
yes, kind of, four of these going in. But the perfect estimate and how we think about it has really four key data elements that are going into ultimately creating this, accurate, reliable, consistent estimate. So the first piece is the patient insurance information, right? And it historically you've gone through like, yeah, anyone can collect a $25 copay. You have so many payers that are enrolled with electronic insurance verification. You need to know deductibles, out of pocket remaining, co-insurance percentages, what's going to be covered, non-covered, right? That is one vertical of data that is mandatory to get really accurate is what are the benefits. The second component is this patient's going to be coming in. How reimbursement works is largely, unless you're on a capitated plan or something, it's largely based on, well, what are the procedures rendered, right? In this traditional fee for service, even most value-based care organizations, it's, well, what are the procedures that the patient's coming in for? We need to know that information so that we know what's going to be billed, what the allowables are. And then kind of that third, the bottom leg is relative to the procedures that you plan to render on that specific appointment, what is the uniquely contracted rate with between you and the payers, right? There are negotiated arrangements. Say, hey, as a provider, we expect this, this much revenue for a knee, a hip, an imaging procedure, an office visit.
Mhm.
And sometimes those are, consistent, right? If you're in Medicare, right, that's a global payment. Everyone gets paid the same rate in your specific locality. But commercial carriers, right, there's a lot of negotiations going back and forth between buyers and payers. That is a differentiator. And then the last thing is kind of the secret sauce, I think, is how does the payer going to treat any combination of codes, all the adjudication and adjustment logic, right? What
Sure.
a modifier is going to do? What
Bundling,
happens
all that
if,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, right? What if it's an advanced care practitioner, a nurse practitioner versus a physician? They might get paid different rates. So all four of those components work in unison to create a really good, accurate estimate. It's like this is a perfect replica of how that uh, potential claim would be adjudicated and then prorate that across the patient share of their care. So those are kind of what I think are the key data elements. And why it's been challenging historically is just piecing this together, right? You've got disparate fragmented systems. You've maybe got contracts housed over here. You've got an insurance verification or eligibility solution over here. Probably neither of those actually have net down revenue forecasting capabilities. So there's just all these disparate systems that have pieces of this data kind of all over the place. So it's a little hard to pull it all together to create that perfect estimate.
And we'll talk more about the timing of when all this stuff happens, but it's also very unlikely, for example, that several of those elements are available at the time we might check the patient in as well, right? Like I probably if I go to the average group and say, hey, what, do you have your contract? Many of them don't have their contract. It's not even available for them to get the answer to that question. It's off the top of their head. They don't know it. And so that's a
Yeah,
big missing gap.
yeah,
Some of the groups that I have talked with, well, let me go back a step. How do you operationalize this? So we've got all these elements, and so a lot of folks are confused about when is the best time to do the estimate, right? So when should a practice be creating the estimate? Is there any specific time frame that's better than another? Where does it fit best into the operational workflow? Those kinds of things.
yeah. That's a good question, and I'll throw into this kind of this time frame that your traditional revenue cycle flow, right, is this dotted line, right, where you go through, you've got your pre-registration, maybe scheduling, maybe there's some insurance verification done up front. Then you go through your clinical journey, then it goes through insurance billing. Patient billing is the afterthought, right? It's, oh, well, whenever we get insurance stuff resolved, then we'll drop that first statement. Hopefully the patient pays on the first, second, or third statement before it gets dropped to collections and maybe written off for bad debt. Moving that patient billing and collections piece from one of the very last afterthoughts that you think about in revenue cycle
Right?
to pre-service, that is where you have your highest leverage, right? Is you as a provider and within revenue cycle, you kind of you hold the reins at that point, right? You schedule the patient. You say, how far out is your appointment going to be? What are you coming in for? Have we gotten the authorization, pre-certification data? Are you financially cleared? That is the opportune time to create the estimate because you have the highest leverage. And if anything is, maybe a patient has an extremely high deductible plan, or maybe you go through to create the estimate and it turns out their insurance isn't actually active or it termed most, very recently, then that gives you enough leeway to work with the patient on a financial counseling. Say, like, well, do you have any other coverage? Do you want to go self-pay for this? What are your other options? So, I mean, there's getting back to the actual time frame, there is from a good faith estimates and a no surprises act, there's a requirement around when you have to create estimates, and that's relative to how far out the appointment is scheduled, right? So you have up to 3 business days to create an estimate, or if it's sort of a short-term add-on, right, only a couple days out, then you have to create the estimate literally the next business day. That's a pretty tight window, and we think if you're electing to do more upfront financial clearance and estimations, if you can get in that sweet spot of maybe 10 to 14 days pre-service, that gives you enough time to make sure that all your ducks are in a row, but not so much time that it might be radically different in some of your benefit accumulators, right? So if you do it today for an appointment that's 3 months down the road, there's a pretty high chance I'm going to go to another
Something's,
physician, see
yeah.
something that's going to eat into my deductible and change what that allowable might be. So we usually think right around that 2 week mark is enough time to be flexible to remedy anything you need, but not so much lead time that it's actually detrimental to some of your accuracy.
I gotcha. But what's implied in what you just said is the best time is before the patient ever comes in. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, because I know many groups when the patient comes in, they actually do a financial clearance right there on the fly, and so some groups I have talked about, they're concerned about that and that it's going to extend check-in. So maybe you could address that. Does it extend check-in time, or maybe some people are worried they're going to have to add a person to do that. I mean, again, what's the best way to navigate that? And it sounds like your answer is to do it beforehand, but maybe you could give us a little more color.
Yeah, especially things, if you're not financially clearing patients well in advance, you run a risk that they literally show up and their insurance isn't active. And it's like, well, who's paying for this? Who's going to cover this care today? And then that's a really big delay, right? Do you reschedule the patient and you have a last minute cancellation or rescheduling where now you have a vacancy in your provider schedule that you're no longer bringing revenue in that window? Um, or you're like, well, are we going to, let's go through, let's vet other insurance options. Do we have to check other commercial carriers? That is going to delay your check-in time inevitably if the patient doesn't have verified coverage pre-service. So the it's not really adding resources, but more shifting where their time is being spent. So instead of everything crunching up until you're kind of backed into a corner of I've got patients coming in, I've got to get them registered, I got to get throughput, I got to get them out of the waiting room. You're taking care of so much of the all the clearance, not only just the do they have insurance, do they know what it's going to cost them, but also a lot of the documentation, right? There are vendors that help you with pre-service documentation, getting HIPAA consents, consent to treats,
Mhm.
getting all that paperwork that is traditionally kind of like I don't know, you got to sit there and I filled out, I've got 3 kids. I filled out many of these forms, right? And it seems like every single time it's 15, 20 minutes worth of paperwork. If I could shift that pre-service, then I'm doing the highest leverage activities when the patient is right in front of me. And so that's where I think of the truly the pre-service in, 1 to 2+ weeks out is that's when you have flexibility. If a payer is down, if you can't verify them electronically, you have to pick up a phone and call them. It would take a lot longer from a throughput standpoint to have a patient wait at your front desk while you're calling their insurance to verify coverage, as opposed to doing it 2 weeks in advance, where you have more flexibility in how you're allocating those resources.
Okay, but you mentioned maybe shifting resources. So is how much of this can be automated and how much of this is going to require some kind of a, FTE shift from staff?
Yeah, almost all of the insurance verification components can be automated. And I'd say, like at Rivet, we have a direct connection with over 1,200 payers, right? So that is going to cover 95 to 98% of your payer mix. And the ones that aren't covered are the finicky ones anyways, right? Maybe it's work comp, maybe it's an auto or
Mhm.
liability plan that can't be electronically verified. But the way that we actually structure things is we look at the patients and the appointments that are on your schedule and we automatically run that insurance verification check in advance of the scheduled appointment. And then we flag back these exception-based workflows. These are patients with high deductibles. These are patients that are not eligible based on the demographic and insurance information that they currently have loaded in your practice management system. So on the verification standpoint, a lot of it, I'd say 95 to 98% can fully be automated. And then a small percentage of that drives into an exception flow where it's like there is an issue with this. You need to follow up with it. And then on the actual estimation piece, right, taking that insurance verification and applying it to what is the patient going to owe, that's where we can see really large automation capabilities in, well, what is the appointment? What are they coming in for? Is it this specific surgical code? Is it this imaging code? Is it a lab panel? Is it an office visit? And because, especially for some of those higher dollar services like imaging, radiology, surgical codes, you generally know exactly what the patient's coming in for, right? Like I maybe it happens, but not often does someone say, "Hey, surprise, I'm here for a knee replacement
Yeah.
today. Can we get this thing taken care of?" Right? That's known weeks in advance, mostly because you've probably had a consult that says, "Hey, your knee is in rough shape. We're going to have to put a titanium knee in," or you have to go through pre-certification or authorization. Um, that's when you know what procedure is actually being done for the patient, and so you've got enough information at the code level to then apply that to the estimation and you've automated the insurance verification, you've automated the code selection and what's being rendered, right? That pulls from what the insurance patient or the insurance that the patient has and they're allowable, right? And then go back to that diagram that I was showing. All these pieces kind of fit in nicely as to, yeah, that could be almost entirely automated.
So let me see if I can infer. Does that mean we need to have some kind of a mapping between whatever the appointment type is that they're coming in for, as well as the services we expect that that appointment type would turn into, like a CPT?
Yep. Yes, and it may not necessarily have to be appointment types, but you can put encounter notes, appointment notes, if you have authorization or pre-arrival notes. A lot of times that information lives in an EMR or practice management system associated with that appointment. But yeah, James, to your point, that then gets extracted almost as if, right, go through transcription and charge entry and coding services, right, where you're
Hmm.
reading physician notes and saying, oh, this means they did this specific procedure. That same kind of like sort of transcription happens, which says, well, this is the appointment, these are the appointment notes. Great. This means code 27447 or 66984 cataract codes. And then that gets put on the estimate that has an allowable benefit attribution. So yeah, you're exactly right that we kind of take the appointment information and associate that and crosswalk that to what does this mean from an actual code standpoint?
Gotcha. Is that work that is done before implementation, or is that something that can be done on the fly? Help me.
Yeah, it's
I
it's usually done in implementation. So
gotcha. All
as
right.
yeah, as interfaces get built from EMR and practice management systems, and we say, well, what templates, if this is the specific appointment type with this data associated with it, let's create an estimate template that says this really means it's a, bilateral cataract code or, insert obviously thousands of other CPT code
Right.
options. But we take that and transcribe it into real CPTs, HCPCS codes that can be used on the estimate.
Great. Great. All right. Now, you guys are doing this day in, day out. I'm just kind of curious from your perspective. What kind of things do you typically hear from patients or from providers about the estimation process? Some people have concerns about that. I'm just kind of curious what you guys typically hear.
Yeah. There's a couple things. I mean, on the we love it side of things, it's, what we were talking about right at the beginning was patient IR is getting so much higher. The residual share that patients owe is getting so much higher. Like we've wanted to do this, we just haven't had a mechanism to efficiently do this. Like we're super pumped. On the like concerns side of things, we get asked every now and then, like, well, what if a patient sees that bill and they're like, well, I can't afford that. Maybe it's a high dollar surgical case and they have a $5,000 deductible or a high coinsurance and out of pocket plan. And that specific encounter is going to be three, four, $5,000 of patient responsibility. It doesn't change 2 months down the road when they get that first invoice that says, hey, this is all hitting your deductible. Surprise, you owe $4,000. It doesn't like make the patient experience any better. And if anything, it detracts from the overall patient experience because they have zero idea what's coming.
Totally
And then,
agree.
30, 45, 60 days post service after that insurance billing gets completed and the first statement drops, that's when they get hit with that $4,000 first statement. And it's like, what am I going to do? I've had no time to plan for this. I had no idea that I would owe this much for this specific care. Like healthcare, I mean, benefits they're complex, right? There's not only are there a lot of layers, but you're then getting multiple bills from providers, from surgical centers, from hospitals, from anesthesiologists, and piecing all that together is overwhelming. And so it really improves the patient experience is our kind of our response to, the patient, like, well, what if they're intimidated by that? It's like it doesn't change 2 months later. If anything, it
Yeah.
gets worse because now it hits them in the face with a surprise and they owe that bill right then, trying to start collections. So that's one of the things we hear a lot is like, well, what are our patients ready are, in healthcare, unlike really any other industry, including dental, right? Dental, we're pretty good at generally saying, hey, $25 for a fluoride treatment. Like, okay, I'm in the chair, let's do it. Lather that stuff on me. I won't eat for 3 hours. Medical is just so different in that patients aren't really cognitively in the space to say, I'm associating care with costs. And I think it is a much better experience for the patient to at least know ballpark figures. And maybe you don't require full collections up front, right? Maybe you require a deposit, or maybe you can initiate a short-term payment plan from pre-service and say, yeah,
Hmm.
instead of it hitting you in 60 days, let's start that payment arrangements now and maybe structure those payments over the next 3 or 4 months. So
Yeah.
that's one of the biggest kind of questions that we hear.
What about the patient's perspective, right? So I've had clients where the patient comes in and literally asks them, and they're not prepared to answer that question about what their responsibility, and they say, oh, we'll have to get back to you. What's the patient's perspective about, what kinds of things do patients typically say once someone has transitioned to where they're doing estimations?
Yeah, I'll use kind of a personal family example where it's like, I thought I had insurance. What are they not paying for this? It's like, well, you do. And then it's kind of fun to always talk through the revenue cycle math of like, well, who pays for a contractual adjustment? Where does the rest of the charge go? It's like it's fairy dust. It gets, it dissipates into the abyss. But then educating the patients on, well, this service, you have this much remaining on your deductible. You have to pay 100% of that deductible before insurance ultimately kicks in for these services. Then you split it, right? Maybe you're a 70/30, an 80/20, a 90/10 plan. Uh, so a lot of the questions are like, I thought I had insurance. It's like you do, but you also have a $2,500 HSA high deductible plan. You have to pay for that before insurance really kicks in on these, many of these services.
Yeah, and how many patients actually understand how their benefit plans actually pay out? Very,
Yeah,
very few, very few, right?
yeah, yeah.
Oh, well, all right. Now, you told me a mind-blowing statistic last time we talked. You said that somewhere around 60% of patients are willing to pay for their full responsible balance before they even come in. So that is huge. That got me very excited. So what can you actually collect from patients pre-service?
Yeah,
What's possible?
that's a great data point. And where I, if you're looking at and assessing your own revenue cycle and the opportunity to accelerate those collections, it's pretty clear the patients who are, good patients in the sense of they generally try and pay within that first statement. That's the same cohort of patients that would largely pay pre-service, right? If they're paying on the first statement, they say, this is what I owe, this is for the medical care, instead of waiting 2 or 3 months, I'll prepay. And that's kind of where we get to that 60 or so percent target. And then we also look at within Rivet, there's a payment processing component where you can send the estimate to the patient and they can pay. And I look at the percentage of patients that pay through these secure payment links, and that supports that percentage of there's a big opportunity to move those from post-service collections to pre-service collections. And so the driving improvements, and I'm sure we'll always dive into the ROI case, but accelerating the payments, you have not only just physical acceleration of cash from 1 to 2 to 3 months to pre-service,
Yeah.
but just the lower AR, better financial hygiene, and on the very back end of things, reduce bad debt and reduce patient write-offs. And then anything that happens post-service now goes into your cost to collect, right? So you have statement costs, right? I was talking to a practice of ours the other day. They're saying right now they send on average it's about $1 per page of statement costs is
Right.
what they're sending. And imagine that there's going to be, I don't know, 40% of your patients that aren't going to pay that first statement that are going to get a second statement, and probably a portion of that they're going to get a third statement, maybe a letter, maybe an outbound call. Those are all collection costs that go into your operating margin as an organization. And so if you can collect pre-service, and these patients that are willing to pay pre-service because they have transparent pricing, they know exactly what the code is, what the insurance is going to cover, what their care of it or their share of their care is going to be, right? That's a lot lower cost to collect on the back end.
And it's easy to ignore that when the size, when the number of statements you're sending out is really low. But I was working with a group in Boston, and they send out over 100,000 statements every single month. So if you're paying $1 a piece for that, that's not an insignificant amount of cost avoidance if you can get the
Yeah.
patient to pay before you ever send a statement. So
Yeah. I mean,
it,
even mailing costs. What are we at? 73 cents a stamp or something?
yeah.
Like
Yeah, it just
that's,
goes up
yeah.
every year, right? Now,
Yeah.
so honestly, it seems like the holy grail, but you mentioned patient portal a second ago. Um, do you need to have a patient portal in order to be able to do estimations and send an estimate to a patient? And by the way, you can speak to the industry as a whole, and you can speak to how Rivet does it if you want. But do you need to have a patient portal in order to be able to pull that off?
Yeah. Short answer, no. A lot of your vendors, your PM systems, maybe you've got a scheduling or registration module that you've bolted on, right? A lot of those are providing portals initially for the purpose of sharing medical documentation securely, but now from another financial engagement point to interact with the patient. the way that we look at it is you don't necessarily have to have a portal, but we do send things via SMS, HIPAA compliant SMS text message, via
Mhm.
encrypted text messages, via HIPAA compliant emails. Uh, we do have customers of ours that still mail it out, right? Put it in a window envelope and fold it up and send it out because, like, yep, we've got patients that kind of expect that. Is they religiously open up their mail every single day. They look at what it's gonna, what's arrived that day. Um, so I think the best practice is around the electronic communication. It's incredibly cost efficient. You have a lot of verification of delivery, right? I mean, think about return mail. The feedback cycle for return mail is atrocious, right? It takes anywhere from 2 to 5 days for someone to get something. They try and deliver it. It's undeliverable. It sits in the post office for another 2 to 3 days. Then it's 1 to 2 days back to your group. So you're looking at for return mail, I don't know, easily a week and a half, 2 weeks before you get that return mail. Talk about instantaneous delivery. I'm sure many people have tried to send an email and it's like, oh, you've got the email address wrong. It bounces back immediately and you get that near real-time feedback. And then I was pulling up, I found uh, these statistics the other day that specifically focusing on email and text message around the comfort of patients engaging in medical communications and healthcare communications and paying for care. So it says 87% of patients are comfortable paying a healthcare bill via email and 83% via text. So you look at just the efficiency, the ability to kind of track and see who's opened the emails, who's actually received the text message. Can we confirm that they viewed the estimate? Did they pay for it? It's very common, and just you know, as generational shifts in who's feeding into the primary users of our healthcare become, different generations, they expect a more consumer mindset, more mobile friendly, like, hey, send it to me electronically. I haven't gone to my mailbox once this week. Like, but if I get a text, I'm going to turn my phone over and pop it open and say, oh, that's interesting. Let me click on that and dive in. So the electronic delivery is really best practice.
Yeah, it's a world of difference. Like I remember when we first were debating whether or not it was okay to send a patient an email, right? And all
Yeah.
of that stuff. So we've come to the point where now the patient's expecting you, and if you're not doing it that way, then they think that you're not, you're not cutting edge.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, let me ask you another question. So, a lot of folks are worried about getting the estimate correct, the amount of the estimate correct. So, coach us a little bit on that. What are all the dimensions of that, and how do we make sure that when we send one out, it's going to be accurate?
Yeah. So I go back to that.
The little
Yes.
super Venn diagram.
Yeah. Right. Is you have to know what you're expecting to get paid from the insurance company, and that starts with your contracts. And it's having your contracts is much bigger strategically than just being able to create estimates. Right. Contracts are your financial lifeblood. It dictates, you know, the funny joke that we've used in, with our sales team and marketing is imagine that you signed up and you got an offer from an employer and they said, yeah, we'd love for you to start. And it's like, what am I going to get paid? It's like, we can't tell you that, but you'll find out when that first paycheck comes and they're to be able to deduce what your payment is. Like you would never take that job,
No.
right? Never. But it's, providers credential and enroll with payers and they're like, they never get copies of the fee schedules, the allowable. So they don't know what do I expect for a level 3 versus a level 4? What do I get paid for these surgical codes? Uh, so zooming out from just estimates for a second, having your contracts modeled is a necessity for all hospitals, all physician organizations, ASCs, standalone ER, like anyone, because it dictates what are you going to get paid for all of these services rendered. And you need that to be able to do cash forecasting, to be able to make sure you're getting paid according to your contracts. So we see that as, like, oh, I didn't even realize my contract shifted, right? Sometimes they shift in the middle of the year. Sometimes they follow Medicare and they shift at the beginning of the year. Is make sure you're on top of your contracts so that you know what the actual net revenue for your services are going to be. That's like probably the number one thing that we see from a variance standpoint. And then the second is, do you know how benefits are going to apply? And I'll use kind of two examples. The first is we'll call it a general surgery practice, who they're only billing for the surgical component, the surgeon fees
Mhm.
of a general case. That's only, I wouldn't even say half. That's like 20% of the total financial experience between payer, provider, and patient. Because then you've got probably an anesthesiologist, you've got the facility piece. Um, but understanding how your invoice or your claim is going to interact with others. And do you get your claims in quickly, like 1 or 2 day charge lag, and you usually get hit with most of the deductible? Uh, do you hold your claims for a few days because the surgery center is generally going to hit the deductible? Maybe you own a surgery center and you have to report on both sides of that equation. Um, so the benefit attribution and like who's getting the deductible, that's sort of what we see as like the second like cause of inaccuracy. It's like, oh, well, I thought we were going to collect the deductible, but it turns out the surgery center got their claim in the next business day and that was processed first.
Yeah. Well, that could be good in some scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Here we are talking about collecting from patients. Yeah.
But you bring up an important thing, right? I've had like literally, I was just talking to a group last week in New England area that actually did not know their contract, and they said, James, we'll never get it. And it blows my mind that they have contracts with payers that are like that, where they don't know how much they're going to get paid. But and you're welcome to speak just to Rivet if you want to on this. But a lot of people, even when they have their contracts, they're worried that a solution that helps them estimate patient balances ahead of time is going to require an insane amount of data entry on their part to get the contract into the system. So how is that handled in the industry? How do you guys handle it, Rivet? Whatever, however you want to go with that.
Yeah. This is prior to Rivet, I was in management consulting and did a lot of revenue cycle work around contracts. So very contracts are very near and dear to my heart. But kind of what I look at, generally there are um, if you have a like the gold relationship is if you have a provider relations rep, a network relations representative at the payer,
Hmm.
that's your best resource. If you don't have one of those and they're getting fewer and further between to stay tight with them, is try other avenues. Can you go through credentialing and say, hey, I believe my providers are credentialed. Here's a provider roster. Can you help us get a copy of our contract? And then from a kind of macro level industry shift, this data is getting more and more public. So there's something called the Transparency Coverage Act that's been around for almost 2 years, I think, that requires these payers to publish in machine readable files all of their in-network contracted rates and their out-of-network historical allowables. And it's public data. Now I air quote public data because we have a literal MIT rocket scientist who is, working from an engineering standpoint to, import and parse and digest this data. And it takes that level of individual. And, there's vendors that do this in the market, Rivet being one of them. But it allows you to see, well, what does the payer think my rates are? So if you don't actually have a copy of your contract or your raw fee schedule, there are these transparency and coverage data files that you can pull up and say, okay, what are my rates for these codes? And you can pull them down and start to build those into your contract modeling. Um, One of the things that we do at Rivet is any contract documents you receive, right? Maybe you have a United Healthcare payer appendix that's just a page long and it gives you all these different percentages of CMS. We have a team of contract analysts that are highly trained and specialized to do nothing else other than model out your contracts in an account for you. So you have a digital copy of, hey, there are rules that maybe I get paid 125% of CMS RBRVS, 110% of the CMS lab. I get paid my quarterly CMS ASP drug schedules. Our team takes those rules and converts them into rates. So it knows that, hey, that actually means that for a 99213, I'm getting paid $121 for all other 16,000 CPT and HCPCS codes. This is my rate for every single one of those. So that's just one of the ways that we do it. But yeah, industry data, transparency, and coverage. If you have a vendor that allows you to access that data, but if you have a way to get your original contract through provider network relations, credentialing, a good copy of your original contract and subsequent amendments is a pretty good thing to have on file.
No doubt. So I have a bunch more questions I want to ask you here, so I got to worry about getting too off in the weeds here.
Yeah.
That public source, does that go all the way down to the group member, the group
T-
number? I mean, so we
Tac,
could see
yeah.
copays that they sell a different copay to one employer than they do to another employer. Is that in the
Yeah,
data?
it's down at the tax ID and the NPI level. So you can
Outstanding.
see, if you're looking at ABC multi-specialty group and you're located in this state, you plug in, your group, your tax ID, your NPIs, And you say, well, what are the other entities? Maybe it's XYZ multi-specialty that's in your neck of the woods, and maybe you compete for provider resources and patient share, is you can literally see what are they getting paid. And if that's something used for leveraging negotiations, for making sure that you have the rates on file for pricing transparency and patient estimations, yeah, like you can see literally what other groups in your
Yeah.
your
Think
zip,
about
your
that. You could use that
neighborhood,
for
your
negotiation. I know
yeah,
you guys do some of that too. We'll have to have
yeah,
you back on sometime to talk about that side of what you do.
yeah.
But so I want to summarize what I think I heard you said a second ago, which is at least how Rivet does it. I don't know how other vendors in the space do it, but you model the contract for the client. Is that what you said?
Mhm,
Okay, so they don't have to enter all that in. All right, that's great.
mhm,
All right, so let's talk about the thing that excites me the most here, and that's the financial impact. And when a group's doing well, they might, probably collects most of the patient balance somewhere between 30 and 60 days, maybe later. With patient estimation, it seems like it would be possible to move that to 0 days or even negative days, right? You're doing it before you actually render the service,
mhm.
um, if we're collecting it before they come in. So, what kind of impact can providers expect, right? So, you're talking to a group here that doesn't do patient estimation today. They're thinking, hey, maybe I want to do this. What kind of an impact should they expect to get? How do they benefit?
Yeah, and I spoke on this a little bit ago on from a cash and an AR standpoint. That's your right, that's your bread and butter of ROI and return on investing in an estimation process. So the cash acceleration, and I'll use one of our customers specifically. So they were collecting on average, they're an good sized orthopedic group, but they were collecting about 400 grand at pre-service and point of service cash every month. That was kind of their just running log. They've now been on Rivet for a while, and they're collecting about $1.7 million in pre-service and point of service cash. So that's a huge shift in when and where that money is coming in. And so that's from an acceleration standpoint, very valuable, right? Patient is typically one of the longest lagging metrics of like from data service to when the patient is actually at a zero balance, right? You'll be lucky if you get 30 days. Most of the times you're closer to probably 60 to 75 days where the
Agreed.
majority of of the people who are going to pay have paid, and in that kind of two statement cycle range. But then you have reduced AR. So looking at now different groups are going to look, their AR is split between payer and patient differently, right? Um, if you're a high specialty, you probably have a bigger percentage that's going to patient because you're hitting a lot of deductibles versus like, preventive care, primary care. That's most of that stuff's covered and you're waiting on insurance and it's covered at 100%. So each group might be a little different, but you can expect, a pretty substantial decrease in your patient AR. And whether that's truly self-pay or self-pay after insurance, both of those are going to get positively impacted. And then the last metric that I talked about was looking at your bad debt. So, you know, ebbs and flows depending on if you're, PCP versus specialty versus hospital. But if you're generally writing off kind of less than 5% of your revenue between insurance write-offs and patient bad debt, you're like, okay, that is sustainable. Imagine that you're writing off less than a 0.5% to patient bad debt because these conversations are accelerated to pre-service. You set up payment plans, payment arrangements, get these deposits and payments pre-service or at point of service. That is going to trickle through to the very back end metric, which is a dramatically reduced patient bad debt write-offs. And that's expensive, right? Think of everything we've talked about from cost to collect, statement costs, cost to have your CBO, your billing office, or your revenue cycle team following up with patients. Like you will have residual lower costs to collect on patient receivables because you just have less of them because you've collected more upfront.
Yeah, so for those that follow our KPI series, you're going to see that in several different KPIs. You'll see it in your AR days, right? Your AR days are going to go down. Your bad debt is going to go down. He just gave you a 0.5% figure, which would be that would be incredible actually to get
Mhm.
your total AR go down, and also your AR over 120, at least patient AR anyway, will go
Yep.
down. So all of those are KPIs that you would see notice going different here. So let me shift gears here a little bit and talk about communicating with the patients, right? So this is going to be new to them. What are the best practices around sending and communicating, these kinds of estimates to patients?
Yeah, I think. even before a patient receives an estimate, and there's a lot that we can talk about that is like how you actually articulate that it is an estimate, what is a deductible, how you educate patients on, right? The topic we were talking about are what questions do patients, bring up. It's like
Right.
a lot of people don't really have a full, like a firm grasp in how does how does insurance work? How does, what do they pay? What do I pay? So you can always educate, and that's a lot of that is covered on the estimate itself. But I think setting expectations, if maybe, I'll use an ophthalmology group that we work with for cataract codes, they come in and they do a cataract consult. And at that point, the provider works with them, says, yes, you're a great candidate for cataracts. Let's get you on this schedule. And then they say you can expect an estimate of your services, about approximately 2 weeks prior to your appointment. And they set the expectation that we will be communicating financial components of this visit prior to your appointment. And you can expect that. Um, so that's like kind of touch point opportunity number one is if you have the patient in the office for some sort of consult, pre-surgical routine, like let them know that they can expect an estimate. The second is in how you communicate with them, right? We've all been hit with spam calls, spam emails, spam texts, like, your grandmother's been kidnapped and you need to send $10,000 immediately to free her. Um, right. What practices engender trust with your patients? And that's things like use your practice name, use practice information that lets you know that this is a valid text coming from things. Branding, letters, logo head, the way that we make it so it looks truly like it is the practice that is sending the estimate. Those will all engender trust with the patient. Be like, okay, I'm going to engage with this conversation, and it's not just somebody trying to, you know, I don't know, install malware or
Right. Right.
spyware on my phone or something. So those are kind of the pre things. We've seen some of our groups will put actual signs in their lobby around estimations and pre-service financial liability. They also share financial policies. So I'll use another example that they do a lot of higher dollar surgery cases, and they set up a down payment requirement based on the patient responsibility. Right. So if it's less than $500, it's payment in full. If it's 500 to 1,000, it's at least a $250 down payment. If it's 1,000 to 2,500, they collect a $500 down payment. And they've seen that although those are just the minimums, they've actually shifted to people are paying more of their total balances up
Sure.
front. And for the ones that are just paying that minimum 250, 500, they've noticed a drop off in last minute no shows and cancellations because the patient's now financially vested in, hey, I'm already in this thing $250. I'm not going to reschedule it for another
Uh,
month. Like I'm going to come in. So they've seen some of these higher dollar vacancies on their schedules that weren't planned, just those drop off because the patient's now engaged financially with the practice.
Interesting point. And I guess to some degree, they just made an appointment, right? So us corresponding with them right after that is would seem like natural thing for the patient to me. So what if a client's using a portal, then they're going to use whatever communication the portal uses. But if they're not using the portal, and you can speak specifically to Rivet if you want on this, what's the patient seeing? What are they getting in a text or an email?
Yeah, the text has text messages aren't inherently secure, so we don't ever send any information, and you shouldn't ever. Your provider should not be sending raw healthcare information in the body of a text message. It's not encrypted, at least on an end-to-end basis. So how we structure things is we send them a hosted secure link. So your estimate from ABC multi-specialty is ready. Please click the link to verify. The first link they get is a digital HIPAA consent where they have to input personally identifying information. It's the exact same as if you're going a HIPAA consent at the practice, right?
Right.
We're now interacting. We want you to know that we're keeping your data safe. Then we send the link with the link to the estimate and we host it so it can be secure and encrypted end to end. And then when that patient has verified, they get the secure link to the estimate. And it is, if you can think of how messy many statements are, it's probably the
Yes.
cleanest PDF I can think of. It's got big bullet. Here's the information that matters to you most. It is an estimate. This is your share of your patient liability. On the left side, it has visit information, where the benefits are at, education on, hey, this is how much of this appointment is using deductible, using coinsurance, what your out of pocket's going to be. In the middle, we have all the data requirements for good faith estimates. So CPT codes, what is the description behind those codes? Where is the service taking place? Who's the provider for that service? Is there a phone number if they have questions? And then they have a big block for notes. So like a lot of our imaging groups, like don't wear jewelry, don't wear deodorant, like
Mm,
all these pre-appointment reminders.
sure,
That's
sure.
just another opportunity to be like, hey, this is everything you need on one clean interface and layout that tells you exactly what you need to know, little things of like, hey, just reminding you about this. Um, so that's what we send to patients. And I think the the
But just to
clarity, yeah,
summarize,
yeah,
they don't actually need to have a portal then in order to do that. Everything you just said
nope,
there can be done without, I don't have to stand up a portal to be able to do any of those things.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. Yeah, that's amazing. All right. All right. So a lot of folks are thinking, oh yeah, but there's probably a bunch of little hidden secret things that could go wrong on something like this. So what 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 are some of the pitfalls or bear traps, that people that should be looking at to avoid if they're going to try to adopt patient estimation?
yeah. Uh, the pitfalls, and I don't think we've talked about this yet, but it's like, well, what if I collect too much? What if I do collect that deductible and
Right.
it turns out, I collected $1,500, but the 835 ERA remit comes back and the patient only owes $100 to our practice.
Sure. Or the
Is,
surgery was processed sooner, and so the
exactly.
deductible was met, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the things that, and I'll point to, another customer example and almost direct kind of paraphrased quote they showed up was, we spent just thousands and thousands of dollars collecting from patients on the back end. We had phone lines staffed, from 7 to 7 every single day to try and answer patient questions. So we had people literally, a support team ready to connect with patients. And they're like, that was a really big cost. We do get credits, we do have opportunities to refund, but they would much rather spend a fraction of the cost cutting a refund check to a patient for an overpayment than all of the money that they're spending to collect on residual, on open balances from patients. They said, it's a fraction of it, right? We're not refunding every single estimate. There are just ones that it's like, to your point, maybe the surgery center got it first. Maybe we, I don't know, quoted this code, but did a different code. And so the residual was less than we expected. Is a fraction of the cost to refund a patient as opposed to collecting on all of those balances post service and maintain outbound support lines, inbound support times, from 7 to 7, having people staffed on the phones just waiting for patient calls. Like, it is a much smaller fraction of the cost. So that was like one thing that was like, well, yeah, we have credits, but we only have a few of them. And it's way better for us to think about refunding a credit as opposed to the 100% of the patients that we now have to send residual statements to. So that's one. Is like, what if we
Oh,
got it wrong? What
yeah.
happens?
So it sounds like your summary is there's not a lot of pitfalls. It's just that you have a new thing, which sometimes you have a credit that they have to deal with, right?
Yeah,
And it
and
sounds
then
like your argument is that it's better to have that problem than it is to have that the other problem where you can't collect the balance from the patient.
yeah, yeah, and then the other false positive that we see a lot is, I wouldn't say a lot, but that comes up is when a fee schedule now becomes obsolete, right? It's changed and you don't realize that it's changed. And maybe you're saying, yeah, for this service, it's going to be, I don't know, $183. But that fee schedule has changed. Maybe you negotiated it
Mm.
proactively. Maybe it's just passively been changed by the payer. And instead of $183, it's now $175. That is something that we see, and we quickly flag those as uh, on the we have an estimate accuracy report where we will get claims and remits flowing into Rivet where we try and associate those to the estimate. And then we'll bucket if what the estimated patient responsibility, if it's different than what it says on the claim. It says here's the PR1 deductible, PR2 coinsurance, PR3 copays. If it's different, we try and bucket it into a root cause. And is it because benefits were vastly different? Like maybe we said it hit the deductible, but it didn't. Is it because you actually did a different code? Maybe you estimated a level 4 E&M code, but you ultimately got in, it was a quick visit, it was a level 3. Uh, is it because maybe the rates were fundamentally wrong, right? We expected $183 based on the contract you have loaded, but it's $175 is what the allowable was. So we go through and we try and bucket out if we can match a claim and a remit to an estimate, we try and bucket it out that says this is why we got it wrong and show you all those estimate examples. And you'd be like, oh yeah, well, we did a different surgical code than we originally estimated. Of course, we're going to be different. So that's how we
So,
try and bring visibility into the
so if
discrepancies.
we act on that feedback, then maybe we only have that problem once or twice. We don't have to keep dealing with it over and over again.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, I'm never going to get to all my questions, so I can tell that. So tell us about the payer side of this whole formula. How much support do we need from payers to pull this off? How many payers support this? Is there anything that's needed there once we have our contract? Help us understand that part of it.
Yeah. The payer side of things, you mentioned the first was you just got to know what you're getting paid for by that payer. And some just use CMS as a baseline and say, oh yeah, we pay the same as Medicare because we're a Medicare Advantage product. Um, so that's a component of payer engagement. The other one is, does the payer support benefits and insurance verification? And you know,
Well,
generally we think about 95 to 98% can be verified electronically,
yeah.
right? Our network's about 1,200 payers. Um, but even if they can't be verified electronically, you can still create an estimate. And think of, I'm thinking specifically around our interface where if you say this payer, pays $183 for this code, and but they don't have electronic insurance verification where you can send a 270, 271. Your only other option is to literally pick up the phone and call the payer. And this still happens today. They call the payer and say, is this patient active? What's their deductible? What's their coinsurance? What's their out-of-pocket max? Do they have a copay for this visit? And then they take that and just plug it into the benefit template that we have in Rivet. And
Mm,
then all the rest of it's going to calculate like, okay, this is the allowable, this is the adjudication logic. We've applied those benefits that you entered in to that estimate. So that's how we kind of bridge the gap on where payers don't have an EDI connection.
hmm
Um, you can just plug the benefits via phone, and like I said, it's typically less than anywhere from like 2 to 5% of your patients can't be verified electronically.
Yeah, that is a anyway, that's a nice workaround actually.
Yeah,
Most payers do support this. That's with my personal experience.
yeah,
Well, again, I want to get to at least a couple questions here. I think we already have more questions than we have time to answer, but all of this is really exciting to me. So just curious, do you have any data on how much of a return that practices can expect? I mean, we already talked about the KPIs and all that. So if this is the same answer, that's fine. We can move on. But um, maybe a case study or something that you have. What should a practice expect? Hey, I'm going to do this, and I need to go sell it to my docs. How do I convince them that changing our process to where we're doing patient estimation is worth doing?
yeah. Now, do I guarantee that everyone will see a 350% increase in their pre-service point of cash? Right? No, no. But will you see a very dramatic, especially if you don't have any type of, if you're only collecting copays, then think of how much bigger deductibles are. And the financial impact is going to be a lot bigger if you have some specialty component to your surgery. If you have that surgery, if you have those imaging codes that are thousands of dollars, that's where you start to see that exponential uptick in return because just the patient liability is always going to be so much higher than primary care, family medicine, pediatrics. But it's certainly not. There's there is still a return for those from making sure that the patients have active coverage. So I think realistically, you could expect to double, potentially triple what you're doing pre-service, point of service collections, and probably even more extreme if you're only collecting copays today. Then move that deductible piece in, apply that kind of 60% prorated factor of who we think are good candidates to pay for their services in advance, and then look at the timing of your patient cash. I would use this as probably the best ROI indicator and look at what is the percentage of patients that pay within, probably call it 21 days of getting their first statement, right? Depending on what your payment terms are, within that first statement being received by the patient, if they pay within 21 days, those are your good patients. Those are the ones that are gonna pay. They have all the intentions. Think of a large portion of those could be moved to pre-service and the impact that's going to have from
Mm.
45 to 60 days to now pre-service. Those are the patients that are typically going to pay for the estimates pre-service anyways.
Okay, I want to get to some questions, but believe me,
Um,
I left a lot on the floor here. So let's do so Shelley, has asked a question. Do you work with DME and telehealth visits? Examples, CPAPs, POS, home versus point of service.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's a great question. And DME, if you're a DME vendor, then you've got different rates for your with your modifiers, right? Your NU, RR, your rental versus purchases. So DME has a benefit line that's it's called a service type code. And you may want medical care, you may want ASC facility care, you may want MRI CAT scan, or you may want durable medical equipment. Um, there is a service type code that says, payer, I want to know what this patient's plan is for DME benefits. And then you can plug that in with, is it a new machine? Is it an
yeah,
RR, a
you're going to need
rental
a little
machine?
inventory component to that too in order to
Yeah.
calculate it. Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah, DME has benefits, telehealth has benefits, and they've created a service type code for telehealth, given that it's, really ramped up so much in the last probably 5 years, right? Now you've got benefits that says, well, you might get paid a different rate and you might have different coverage for telehealth E&M code versus in-office E&M code. So now you can see like what is the telehealth component,
Okay,
you know?
good. Hopefully, Shelley, that answers your question. If not, you can shoot another one to us real quick. Um, another question we got is how long does it typically take to implement a new patient estimation process? So they're going from nothing to implementing patient estimation. How long between when they decide they start doing it to when they're actually doing it does it take?
Yeah. It two driving things, going back to that, SWOT diagram, all the four specialties. One being contracts and rates. If you have current versions of your contracts and fee schedules, our team of contract analysts typically turn these modeling things around in 3 to 5 business days, right? You send us all your documents, we process those, we call it Rivetize. We build those out in your account. You now have electronic versions of all your fee schedules. The second is the interface, right? So we love, it's not a requirement, but we love near real-time data interoperability with your host system, whether that's an EMR, practice management system, patient accounting system. And we build either HL7s, ODBC connections, APIs. And if it's an HL7, that tends to take a few weeks to get set up. We have to get an IT team involved, build the actual interface. If you have a newer system like Athena, AdvancedMD, Greenways, NextGens, they have APIs, which are, think of it like a newer age HL7. And we can literally spin up an API because we have these partnership connections in one day. We basically
Wow.
authorize consent it, they go and build it. The next day, we're ready to provision and patients and appointments, the associated demographics, appointment details that we talked about that are so helpful in automating a lot of this. That starts coming over in near real time. So when you make a change in Athena, for example, or AdvancedMD or NextGen, that automatically comes over to Rivet and we can do all the legwork with it.
Okay, there's about
Yeah.
half a dozen questions that I didn't get to, so
Yeah.
we will send
Yeah.
emails out to you folks. Thank you for being on the show. We heard you. We'll send you an answer. But since we're running out of time here, great engagement on the Q&A side. Thank you everyone for that. Um, Andrew, I really appreciate you being with us and letting me go anywhere I want to go with the conversation on this. So I appreciate you coming on. One of the questions, by the way, which I knew would just take us off, is about as soon as they heard about the contracts, they wanted to know if they can do underpays. So maybe we'll have to have you back to talk about policing underpays from the payers. But if folks want to talk to you more or they want to learn more about
Yeah.
Rivet specifically, how do they do that?
Yeah, I'd love, and hopefully you can see this. It's just, it'll link to our site. You can also send us an email if you're curious about the estimations and James, what you were just talking about, you know, I talked about a lot of residual value in getting and understanding your contracts. One, helping patients to understand their share of the care, but the other being um, from an underpayment and an audit standpoint, are you actually getting paid? Can you properly forecast what your net revenue is? Are you getting paid the net revenue that you're expecting for that? So I'd love to hear from you guys. You can hit us up sales@rivethealth.com. If you have your phone, you can hold it up and scan that little QR code. It'll take you right to us. But yeah, would love to hear if you have any follow-up questions. James mentioned we had, quite a few that I don't know. I guess we're both ramblers and just ran out of time talking about healthcare. But if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, please, send us a note. I would love to follow up on things. Um, And yeah,
If you
love to hear
if
from you all.
if you would like to see us do a whole session on policing payer contracts and underpayments and things like that, let us know and we'll get that scheduled. I think we're booked out till the end of the year, but maybe we could do something in Q1. Um, Everybody on this session is going to get a link to the recording of this session along with a special white paper on the best time to do patient estimation in your operational process. We didn't get to cover that because Andy and I are both kind of long-winded, but we thank everybody for being on here. If you have an interest in engaging Rivet, you see the way to do that. Just use that QR code or use the email address on the bottom, or you can reach out to me. I'm happy to introduce you to him. The whole group at Rivet is phenomenal. So thank you again, everybody, for being on. We'll see you on the next one. Take care and yeah, keep fighting the good fight.
James.